Well, hello everybody. I'm Kelly Mitchell. I'm the Executive Director of the Robina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice, and I'm also a member of the Twin Cities Women's Choir, who just sang for you Voices of Hope, composed by Amanda Weber. Can we give another round of applause to the choir? So you're probably wondering, why did we start today with a choir performance? It's a little unusual for one of our CLE events, or for an event that is comprised mostly of attorneys and other interested in the criminal justice system. So each year the choir puts out a contest. It's called the Mary Busman Emerging Composers Contest, and we seek new compositions from women. It's one of the goals of the choir to uplift the voices of women and to encourage women to be composers of music. Amanda Weber was the winning composition this year, her song Voices of Hope. And so as a singer, when I received this song and it was time for me to perform this or to learn this, I realized it's the first time that my personal life has collided with my professional life. I work on criminal justice issues every day. I mostly focused on sentencing law and policy. And I also realized when we got this song that I also think primarily of men when I do my work, because men do comprise the majority of offenders who are in the criminal justice system. And we're often asked if we've done work on women's issues and why the number of women in the prison system is skyrocketing. And no, we haven't. We don't focus on that because it's such a small number of people in comparison to men that it's not, you don't get as much bang for your buck if you figure out what those issues are, right? So this seemed like the perfect time to start that conversation. So this really inspired me to want to put this session on today. We also have one of our researchers, Ebony Ruland, has always worked on this issue, and especially on the issue of incarceration in relation to children of incarcerated parents. And so she was also extremely interested in starting this conversation today. So that's why we're here. That's why we're here, and that's why we had that little bit of an unusual start to show that the two worlds can collide successfully. And I hope you enjoyed that part of it. So now let's get started. Our first speaker is Amanda Weber, the composer of Voices of Hope. She is a doctoral student, she's a doctoral candidate in conducting here at the University of Minnesota. Her thesis is built around this project, Voices of Hope, working with women at the Shakopee prison, and she's interested in using music as a tool for social justice. And so I'd like her to come up and tell you her story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today. I'm just thrilled to be a part of this experience. It's something that I never would have been a part of just like 1 year ago, probably. So I'm so happy to be here. And hopefully we can get our PowerPoint up here and get started. So. Are we in business? Here we go. Okay. I'm an East Coast girl. I was raised in the suburbs of North Carolina, and while there's certainly farmland around, that was never part of my experience. So the first time I visited a farm was when I was in college in Iowa. And I remember so vividly standing with the farmer as he told me the names of his cows. Well, I looked from cow to cow to cow, and I said, "How can you tell them apart? They all look exactly the same to me." Well, he didn't really like that comment very much, and I see in retrospect that maybe that is not the best thing to say to a farmer. But I'd like to blame my ignorance on my brain, which is wired to make connections between things. We like to group things together. Sameness is comfortable, and it makes sense. You would think I learned my lesson that day. It's almost 10 years later, and I find myself volunteering weekly at the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Shakopee, where I teach women to sing. I've served these women every week for the past year and a half, And I must confess, it took some time for me to realize that even though they're all dressed in the same uniform and grouped under the same title of criminal, inmate, offender, each woman has a name, a personality, a past, and a future that are different from one another. And as such, my work as a teacher is to treat each woman as special in her own unique way. Of course, my brain doesn't want to do this. My brain sees the visual similarities of a choir that looks like a sea of gray. And on top of that, I have the added challenge as choral conductor of trying to get the group to make a unified sound. So not only do they look alike, but they start to sound alike. And I have to actively remember that what stands before me is a room full of identities, a rainbow of knowledge, gifts, hopes, and dreams. I wanted to start my talk today with this image because I don't think I'm the only one who struggles with this. It's convenient to speak using general labels, many of which we'll hear today: prisoner, formerly incarcerated, even woman. My hope is that we can activate our imaginations to remember that behind these labels are names: Katie, Michelle, Lauren, Monique. The statistics we care about are only one part of the story. If we forget their real-life applications to real live people, then what's the point? We're here today to talk about the fastest growing population in prison: women. Over the past 35 years, the number of women in prison has skyrocketed. Between 1980 and 1990 alone, the female incarceration rate nearly tripled. Here in Minnesota, these last few decades have seen a 900% increase in female incarceration. How are we not talking about this? Even here, among experts, around 15 Robina Institute in conversation events have taken place, and this is the first one to focus on female incarceration. Of course, the total number of incarcerated men is much higher, which has certainly caught our attention in the last several years. But meanwhile, the rate of growth of women in prison continues to rise, surpassing the men by 50%. Even within marginalized populations, in our research and our direct service, women take a back seat to men. And while improvements have been made and people are finally speaking out about gender equality, we can't deny the ways in which centuries of oppression have infused our systems, including the criminal justice system. I'm looking forward to our speakers and panelists today who will offer a depth of knowledge that is beyond my realm of experience. I'm not an expert in this field. I can't spout off the latest research or recent policy changes, but I can tell you about Sarah, who had never sung in a choir before and was so eager to learn, asking questions about how her voice works after each rehearsal. I can tell you about Tiaja, who sang everything memorized and interjected sassy comments whenever possible. I can tell you about Julie, our musical cornerstone, who was an incredible sight reader and always came to choir with positive energy. There was Alana, quiet yet confident, who played piano in her earlier years. And Ashley, a tough young woman who surprised herself by crying uncontrollably through our entire first rehearsal. "I don't know what's happening to me," she said. "I never cry." That's the power of music. There were 15 women when we first started, and they named themselves the Voices of Hope. Today we're almost 60, and we gather every Sunday afternoon for rehearsal in the visiting room. I often ask myself why this class has become so popular. What is it about music that draws people in? This has become a regular topic of discussion for the Voices of Hope. I'd say we talk about singing about as much as we actually sing. And through that process, I have learned so much about embracing womanhood through song. So I'd like to frame this concept for you today with a wonderful quote from Helen Kemp, who's a legendary conductor known for her work with children's choirs. She says, "Body, mind, spirit, voice, it takes the whole person to sing and rejoice." So let's start with the body. Singing is unlike any other means of making music. Your body is your instrument. The voice can certainly develop and improve with lessons and practice, but on some level, what you're given is what you've got. This also means that damage to the body damages your instrument. Those who have used drugs or alcohol for long periods of time often struggle with vocal issues. Prolonged stress does incredible damage to the voice. Making these realizations as a singer helps us to view our bodies as sacred. In order to sing well, we need to eat well, sleep well, practice deep breathing, and discover healthy posture. These practices over time help lead to things like improved self-esteem, confidence, and joy. Of course, we can't discuss the female body without acknowledging its gift and desire for motherhood. I'll always remember the day I taught a Bolivian lullaby to the Voices of Hope and looked up from the piano to see every woman rocking back and forth as she sang. As women, our bodies have an innate need to nurture. 75% of the women at Shakopee are mothers, separated from their children, a huge challenge of incarceration that I'm sure we'll hear much more about today. Although music alone cannot solve this issue, singing certainly awakens the female body to the experience of childhood and children. When you sing, your body isn't the only thing that's hard at work. Your brain has to be engaged in incredible multitasking to process all that singing requires. As a result, women get to exercise creativity and imagination in an otherwise monotonous environment. The brain also releases dopamine when you sing, another nice reward, which Julie noticed after our first concert when she said, "I'm in treatment and I have never felt a high like that." It's not so difficult to look scientifically at the ways in which singing affects body and mind. Spirit, on the other hand, is a little more difficult to articulate. One of our recent concert projects was titled "Phenomenal Woman," after Maya Angelou's poem. One day in rehearsal, we went around the room and everyone named someone who was a phenomenal woman in her life. It surprised me that about a third of the women in the Voices of Hope named someone else in the room. They acknowledged that they too were surprised to find such wonderful people and build such positive relationships in a prison of all places. But our human desire for connection cannot be put on hold. In an isolated environment, choir is the least isolated activity imaginable. You can't sing in a choir alone. You get to be your unique self, your individual instrument, but by adding your voice to others, it becomes something even greater, something you couldn't have done on your own. Sharing in this kind of experience allows women to connect emotionally with one another, building a family during this period of separation from the outside world. In fact, one study shows that when you sing with other people, your heartbeats align. I shared this study a while back with the Voices of Hope, and they love to bring it up. Nothing brings them joy like the idea of unity and sisterhood. This close-knit community helps the women to build mutual respect and trust in a diverse environment and exercises their skills of communication, responsibility, and teamwork. Body, mind, spirit, voice. It takes the whole person to sing and rejoice. When I first heard this quote and learned about Helen Kemp's work with children, I thought it was a really cute nursery rhyme. But the more I've looked at it, the more I think it may not be related to music at all. I know what it looks like to see a whole person sing and rejoice. Courtney's body was singing the day she graduated from treatment and invited me to be her guest in the room. Catherine's body was singing after she received a visit in prison from her mom, who had just attended a concert on the outside in support of the Voices of Hope. Taylor's body was singing when, after an entire quarter of furrowing her brow in the back of the room, she shared that choir was starting to transform her outlook from anger to positivity. In fact, as I think about it, the greatest singing I've heard from the Voices of Hope hasn't been music, but a collective enlivening of spirit as they claim their stories and self-worth. Our quote tells us that it takes the whole person to achieve this. If that's true, what is the message for us today? Well, in order to consider the whole person, we cannot ignore that she's a woman. Her womanhood is not an excuse or something to pity. It's not meant to be sexy or flirtatious. In fact, it has no positive or negative connotation at all. It's simply part of her created being. I asked the Voices of Hope what we should know about womanhood and prison, and their responses seem to fall under three vital considerations. First, the path to prison for a woman most often includes trauma. At the correctional facility in Shakopee, which is the only state women's prison in Minnesota, an estimated 90% of women have been abused. 80% have a diagnosed mental illness. Around 60% need treatment for drugs and alcohol, though only 30% are able to receive it due to lack of space and resources. Of course, all of these things are woven together, and so many crimes stem from poverty and the understandably fierce determination and desperation of a mother who will go to any length to provide for her child. So she ends up in prison, where the ratio of men to women is about 13 to 1. Understandably, the rules tend to cater to the majority, and as a result, her needs are often overlooked. She, just stripped of her role as mother and caregiver, is suddenly deprived of touch, an ongoing and complex conversation at Shakopee, among other prisons. I feel this pain too, as a woman and a teacher. The day that Catherine came up to me to tell me her father just died, and I could only respond with empty words and tears in my eyes. Some rules are so absurd, they're almost funny. Did you know that some prisons in the US only allow a woman to have 2 tampons a month? That rule was certainly not created by a woman. Or consider this: a man's masculinity will not be threatened by his inability to shave, or to put on makeup, or to wear attractive clothing. But for a woman, societal pressures have linked her femininity with her looks. Depriving a woman of her outward identity deeply affects her sense of inward self. Time doesn't stop for a woman in prison, and when she returns home upon release, she's expected to pick up where she left off. Women are mothers, daughters, sisters, nurses, coaches, cooks, cleaners, babysitters. It's challenging enough for women to negotiate these identities on a day-to-day basis. During incarceration, these things are lost. Yet afterwards, women are supposed to continue in these roles as before, often with little to no support. One of the things that surprised me early on at the prison was the emotion involved in a woman's release date. In my ignorance, I had assumed that getting out of prison would be a wonderful thing. I've probably seen 10 or more women leave by now, and the reactions are always complex. It's bittersweet for a woman to leave the new community she has built and enter into so many unknowns. In a moment, we'll hear from a panel of formerly incarcerated women, and I can only imagine the comments they've received from a society that expects to see men in prison, but has no understanding of the female experience. We have a lot of work to do, and it's the hardest kind of work. Listening. What is the song our bodies long to sing? What's getting in the way? Who's telling us we can't or shouldn't sing? How are our songs different from one another? What beautiful music might they make if they're put together? When women gather and sing, their voices deliver hope. Notes sound from homemade instruments, bodies singing stories and dreams, tones of love and sorrow. Songs of night tears, generational vocal cords pressed to silence by burdens of the days. Songs at daylight rise with strong melodies. Grace notes energize new births. Choruses beat with hope. May these be voices that people hear. Thank you. So I think we have some time for questions. If there are any, I'd be happy to take them. There are microphones, I guess, that will be coming around. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. There's one in the back.
You mentioned a number of statistics while you were speaking, some of which are on that two-page handout, and some of which aren't. Where are those statistics? That's valuable information.
Yeah, so some of the ones that were specifically related to Shakopee, I received through my colleague Jim Verhooy, who you'll hear again speak today. So he's a great resource for some of the things happening there specifically. Some were from just like the sentencingproject.org or the Bureau for, what is it, Justice, I'm going to get this wrong, BJC or J, yeah, Bureau for Justice Statistics. So some of just the major sites for that. I could write some of those down for you later if you're interested. Thanks for asking. There's one here.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why did you start this choir in the prison, and how did that sort of come to be, and what's the purpose, really? Why did the women join that?
Yeah. Great question. So this is sort of a unique situation in that Jim, who's the educational director at Shakopee, wanted to create a choir class among the other educational opportunities that they have. They had, I think, just a handful of women sort of singing like karaoke before, kind of, and wanted to formalize that a little bit more. And as a U of M grad, reached out to the musicians here at the university, and so I got connected through that. So it was very serendipitous for me. But I formerly had conducted a choir of homeless women in Washington, D.C. for 3 years. So I'm very interested in this kind of work. And so it started with a question and answer session at Shakopee for anyone who might be interested. And I am just always very interested in, like, what do you want to do? Why are you coming to choir? And several of the women really took me aback when they said they thought it could be an avenue for restorative justice. And so for connecting back into their communities and making a difference. through song. And so that has really been a big part of our mission. And I've done a lot of work to bring outside singers into the prison so that there can be that kind of chance to break stereotypes and build bridges and network in the community, even though the choir, it can't leave, of course, to sing. Yeah.
Well, I know most of these women are going to return to their communities, and pro-social supports and activities.
Yeah, I think we have a live stream, so we want you to.
Okay, yeah. So since most of these women are going to return to their communities, and we're pretty sure that pro-social support and activities can reduce reoffense, I'm wondering if you're able to follow them back to their natural communities and provide a space for them to continue their work.
That's a great question. So this has been a big question mark for me in terms of dealing with the challenge of like not being allowed to be in touch with people in reentry. And so, of course, if you have the support of like a nonprofit organization, sometimes you're able to bridge some of those things. And for me, for the past year and a half, it's just been me alone volunteering. So that possibility has not really been created, but we're looking at ways that we could maybe institutionalize this work so that it would open some of those doors. So currently in the Voices of Hope, we do fairly regularly talk about like, hey, when you leave, look in your communities for choirs. And certainly in Minnesota, of all places, there are hundreds of choirs, you know, and to try to encourage folks that it's not just like a fun thing to do, although I think that's what a lot of people would assume, but there are so many valuable things that can come from having that immediate support network and, you know, a positive outlet, people who will drive you, you know, to your next meeting or give you a meal or whatever. So that's like a bigger dream of mine, is how to be more intentional about setting up women when they are released with ways that they can continue singing. Thanks for asking that. Any other questions? There's one over there.
Hi, I'm curious to know, is singing kind of outlawed at Shakopee? Is that like a written rule or an unwritten rule that they can't sing as loud as they want to in the dorm or whatever?
You know, I've heard mixed things on this, to be honest. I have heard from the women that depending on who's on duty or whatever, that they might get, you know, yelled at for singing or dancing or those kinds of things. I think the concern is more that it could be disruptive to others, depending on sort of where and how that takes place. To my knowledge, there's not like a formal written rule that people can't sing, but maybe Jim would say something about that a little bit later. So I do know that for many of these women, I mean, it is obviously, you know, 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon of a real freedom to be able to sing loudly. And honestly, I would say with every choir I've worked with on the outside, I often find myself being like, sing out, don't be afraid, like, come on, you know. And when I first started at Shakopee, I was shocked just by how like loudly everyone was singing. I thought, whoa, like they are just like singing as if their lives depend on it. And I mean, I think for many of them, they do. So thanks for asking. Yeah.
Hello. What has been the main challenge? And I'm very interested in, especially around institutions, how easy has been for you to do the work and to move or transform the work that you started?
That's a good question. You know, I think one thing that's a challenge that so when I first worked with homeless choirs, I would say the biggest challenge was transiency. You didn't know if someone would be there 1 week to the next. And when I started working at the prison, I thought, well, thank God I'm not going to have to worry about that. Like, they'll be there, you know. And I really thought that I would have, like, a group of folks for maybe years. And so I was, I think that was, again, you know, my naivety in, like, learning that people do move on quite quickly, some of them, or they are pulled out of the class for one reason or another, or they're transferred to another prison, or there are just always things happening. And nobody, I am certainly not the like top of anyone's list of like, we got to make sure we tell Amanda about this. So I don't always know what I'm going to walk into on a Sunday and who will be there. And every 12 weeks, it's a new class, and so more people add. And so there's some just things like that, I think, that are logistically a little bit challenging. And I guess my biggest challenge otherwise would be how to share our message without the possibility of leaving the prison. I've had the opportunity to speak to many groups and people who want to hear the choir and want to support and all these things, but it's not easy to bring folks in, and of course, to bring the choir out at this time is not possible. So, thanks for asking. There's one here, and then a couple more. Yeah.
As a former member of the Shakopee Women's Choir, recently released a month ago, Amanda was my instructor there. And one of the biggest things for me while I was there was the connection that we made with the other women from outside of Shakopee. She correlated the women's choir here at the U of M, and there were probably 40 or 60 maybe
40.
Women that actually went above and beyond their duties of being just students, but they came in and sang with us. We had concerts and things like that. So my question is are there plans for that in the future? Are they still staying connected with the women, or do you have other plans in mind?
Yeah, well, good question. Thank you, Teresa. There are always, I have like a million projects of things I would love to do. I'm a dreamer, so that's what I do. But it's a great question, and I actually struggle a lot with, is it more meaningful to like maintain a connection with one group and just keep that going forever, or to have opportunities to keep meeting new people? And I think that what my gut tells me is that it's better to just meet more and more and more people. So that, one of my dreams is that when women leave the prison, that, instead of having to introduce yourself as like, oh, I'm formerly incarcerated, and the feelings maybe that revolve around that you could say, I'm a member of the Voices of Hope, and that people know that choir, and they know that you have done something incredible, and that, I think it's just such a cool, positive story for you to share. And so to me, it's like the more choirs we interact with, the more support you would have in the state upon your release. So that being said, I know Women's Chorus is eager to maintain a connection, and I'm sure we'll find a way to compromise and do both. Yeah. Is there a question up front or no?
I think you've referenced this in a number of ways already, but I'm wondering, do you have the amount and types of institutional support that you need? And what are a few things that you would like to get next to support everything you do?
That's a really good question. We're toying with the idea of creating a nonprofit that would specifically use music to serve incarcerated communities in the state. And so if that's a road that we go down, then we'll need all kinds of support financially and, other numbers of things. In the meantime, it's the sort of project that like we could keep it cheap and free and I could just volunteer for the rest of my life. Or if there was money, if there were people supporting and behind something like this, I think there's a lot more that we could do. So yeah, I think we're sort of in this in-between world right now, and looking for people to say, I want to be a part of this. So if that's you, I would love to talk with you. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I should just add, since no one's asked this, there are a number of other prison choirs across the country, so this is not completely unique. I know of at least 40 prisons across the country that are making music intentionally. And I would say the lead researcher on music in prisons is located at the University of Iowa. And her model for a choir is just slightly different from what we do at Shakopee. Her choir is half inside people, so half inmates, and half outside folks who come every single week for rehearsal. And so it's kind of a community choir model. And you can imagine just the wonderful things that would bring forth. But again, then the more people we bring in, the more of a staff burden that is regularly, and that's just a conversation to have with the prison and to see if that's a direction that we want to go. So we're actually going to try that kind of model for a short period of time, this July and August. I'll be bringing about 16 outside folks to the prison every week to put together a concert with the Voices of Hope.
I'm not sure if you've answered the question that's been floating around, but it's about how have the institutions braced you being in that facility? As you say, you're doing this as a single individual, so has the DOC been receptive? Have they had issues with the work you're doing? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, I mean, so far I would say it has been very receptive. And again, I mean, I would just point out the unique situation that they asked me to start a choir. So this isn't me bringing my agenda and, trying to push something onto them. They asked for a choir. So, so they're getting what they asked for. And, that being said, as a doctoral student, I have a lot of interest in the possibility of sort of researching what we've done and has it been successful and those kinds of things. And that is more difficult, as I'm sure all of you know, in terms of having permission to do that kind of research. So we'll see. I may have a different answer for you in the next year. But so far, I mean, my main contact has been Jim, and he has been he is the reason that the choir exists. And I have had, other staff people who will be on duty and who will come and stand in the room and listen for a while. Or I've had someone say, I've always wanted to take piano lessons and maybe I should start. So I think I'm really curious if there was a way to research it. I would love to just know how has music not just affected the women singing, but created an atmosphere in Shakopee overall. And yeah, one of my friends recently asked, how do people who aren't in the choir respond to the choir? Do they feel jealous that they're not in it, or do they hate the people that are in it or something like that? And I said, no, actually, I think it's more like a sports team. I kind of feel like people are just this is our choir. It's so cool to see when the women come up to we perform at the prison for about 100 incarcerated individuals, and when the choir comes on and people are waving at their friends, and there's just so much energy around that that I would never have expected. So far, my experiences have been positive. I think we're probably out of time. So if you have any other questions afterwards, I would love to talk with you. And thank you again for this opportunity.
Hello. I'm Jim Verhoy. I'm the education director at the correctional facility in Shakopee, which basically means I'm the school principal. That's kind of the easiest way for me to describe my job when people ask me what I do. So I've been asked to moderate this panel, and first of all, want to welcome our panelists here and just say how honored and privileged I feel that they've taken time out of their schedules to voluntarily come here and share their experiences and their knowledge with us. So hats off to all of you for agreeing to do this. We really, really appreciate it. So this part of our day basically is going to be me tossing out a few questions and giving each woman an opportunity to answer the question, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for audience questions. So the first thing I thought I would do is ask each woman just very briefly to tell us who they are, just introduce themselves very briefly, who you are and what are you doing at this point in your life. So I think, Gina, you and I are going to share this microphone.
Awesome. Thank you, and thanks to the people that put it together for inviting us to come and be a voice. My name is Gina Evans, and I currently serve as the Director of Marketing and Community Outreach for Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge. I am a mother to 4 kids and married to the Ramsey County Jail chaplain. I work at Teen Challenge, and I do some work down at the Capitol. I'm on the Executive Board of Directors for the Minnesota Corrections Association. I'm also a board member for the Second Chance Coalition. I'm very active. My passion is to be a voice for people who unfortunately don't have a voice of their own. Is that good? Perfect. And thanks again for having me.
Hello. Oh, this is cool. My name is Courtney. I'm super excited to be here too. Thank you for inviting me. Currently, I live in Forest Lake, and I work as the assistant sober house manager for a sober house of 6 women, and I work part-time at Target too. I'll be going back to school in the fall, and I don't know, I have 2 years clean and sober, so.
I'm Mariah Wilberg. I got out of Shakopee in July 2013. Currently, I am a communications specialist for the Minnesota Department of Health. All my opinions are my own and do not represent the Minnesota Department of Health. I'm supposed to say that. Let's see, I do a lot of volunteer work. I volunteer with the Second Chance Coalition and some work around criminal justice reform. I serve on the board of directors for Claire Housing, which is an HIV housing organization, and I'm also a regular volunteer at the Ramsey County Workhouse. And I live in St. Paul with my husband.
I'm Rhea Smith. I currently live in Columbia Heights, recently married, and I have 1 daughter. I am a psych major at Metropolitan State University. I do some volunteer work. I recently just did some speaking at the Minnesota Psychology Association conference about a month ago.
Excellent. Thank you, ladies. And thank you for the reminder, Mariah. I do work for the Minnesota Department of Corrections, but all opinions are my own, absolutely. I'm not speaking on behalf of the department. So, because I am involved in education, we're going to spend a decent amount of our time talking about education, because I'm biased and I think it's really, really important to talk about. And so the first question that I want to toss out is to just have each of you kind of harken back in your lives and maybe share with our group here what your educational experiences were like growing up. How was your connection to our broader system of education, either in Minnesota or wherever that was that you grew up? So a few thoughts about your own education as a young person.
I'm Courtney. My thoughts are, I started drinking at the age of 11, and I ended up dropping out of school at the age of 15. So I went to an alternative school and was able to obtain a high school diploma by the age of 19, thank God. But I didn't take any college courses until I was incarcerated at MCF Shakopee. So I'm really grateful for that. I spent 9 years in Shakopee, so. And was released 2 years ago.
I would say I might have a little bit different experience than a lot of people I was incarcerated with. I was a straight A student. I skipped a grade in school. I had no problem with the academic part. I did change schools when I was 14 to a very isolated rural school with a lack of funding and programming, and I would say not a very welcoming place. So I can say I think where the school system may have let me down is there was no, I wish there was more mental health incorporated into schools, or maybe healthy self-esteem or healthy relationships or just any sort of life skills to prepare people to be an adult?
For me, I moved here to Minnesota when I was 16, and that is when I dropped out of school. Prior to that, I was in Georgia, and they incorporated the JROTC program, which I think I had more discipline when I was in high school there, because the sergeants were always walking through the hallways, making sure we were on our stuff every day. So when I moved here, I guess just also not having that help or anyone to basically help me with my mental health, or just kind of like, it seemed I wasn't very happy in high school here. I got bullied also, so it was a big change for me.
That's really interesting because I also changed schools when I was 14. And I feel like because of that, I got in really easily with kids that were using drugs and drinking because they accepted me really readily. And so that was the path that I kind of went on. Looking at, education as a young person, before I changed schools, grew up on welfare in Section 8, and one of my most vivid memories of school, and it's not like this anymore, but we got lunch tickets mailed home in the mail, and they were a different color than the kids that got their lunch tickets paid for. And so I have all these memories of like hiding my lunch ticket in my kangaroo shoes with the zipper, until like the last possible second that I could give my ticket over. And so, I think as a society today, we've made some adjustments to make sure that, regardless of income, that kids don't feel like that. But I feel like I always through school felt very different. Growing up in a single parent home and being on public assistance and living in public housing, I feel like I kind of started at a disadvantage.
All right, thank you. So let's fast forward to a time when you're at a place like Shakopee, whether it was Shakopee or somewhere else, and I'm curious about any particular programs, particularly educational programs or classes or groups that you found particularly helpful and that might help those of us who implement those kinds of things to continue down those roads because they worked or they were successful or you found them really, really helpful. Why don't we start with you, Mariah?
Okay. Well, the library was my sanctuary when I was there. I think I spent almost all my time there just reading because I was really determined to, I came to a point where I'm like, I'm 25, I'm in prison, I have an HIV diagnosis, I've got all this stuff going on, and I want to figure out where I went wrong and how can I fix it, because I want my life to be different. So the library was a huge part of that, and there was also really a lot of opportunities to work on myself. So I took cognitive skills programming, I believe 3 times total during my year and a half of incarceration. I took it in the beginning, and then I took voluntary classes, and then there were cognitive skills classes as a part of boot camp. And I think that was very transformative for me because I had never taken the time to question my thoughts. I always just blindly followed them all the way to Shakopee. So it was very freeing to realize just because I think something doesn't mean it's true, and to learn those skills to step back and, be more objective and start to replace those thoughts with something a little more healthy and helpful. Another thing I did while in Shakopee was get my office support certificate through Hennepin Tech. That was an amazing opportunity. I use the skills to this day at work. And I also took a lot of the voluntary classes like resiliency skills, domestic violence, anger management. Any class that I could get accepted in, I was going to do it. And I think another thing that was pivotal for me, there was a lot of volunteers bringing in workshops, and I took a writer's workshop where I feel like it really allowed me to start healing from some of the trauma of my past, to be able to write about it and share that in a safe space and begin to process through it.
For me, I would have to agree. The office support, I took that too. That was really, really helpful for when I got out, because like on the workforce, you have to, you know, if you're working with a computer or wherever, do Excel spreadsheets. I never knew how to do that until I went there. And then also even just working Microsoft Word all together was a struggle for me. But when I took office support, it was really helpful. And then in boot camp, I did the cognitive skills as well, and just doing those, we did these thinking reports like once a week, I think, or maybe more depending on where you were. And that was really helpful because it lets you see, you know, like what your reactions are to things, you know, how your thinking is, and really put it on a piece of paper and rethink everything that you're doing. So that was probably the most, I still do those in my head like every day, like why did I say that, why did I do that, why did I say that, and just try to change it to something more positive.
Well, I don't know that I'm going to make any friends with my response to this. Statistically, and I was part of that statistic, 67% of the people that are currently incarcerated in the Minnesota Department of Corrections are going to be there less than 1 year. I did 3 sentences at Shakopee, and the most time I did over the 6 years that I was in and out of Shakopee was 8 months. And so I never was able to participate in drug and alcohol treatment, even though I had a raging IV meth addiction, and I never was able to participate in any of the schooling either. I did a little GED work my first time in, and then got my GED after I got out, and then at that point I really wasn't eligible for any kind of education while I was there because I didn't spend enough time in a row in the institutions. So education after prison, though, changed my life. It's a hugely important part of being able to get back on your feet and get out from underneath the stigma of being a convicted felon. So.
I did have enough, I know that loophole you're talking about. I was fortunate enough to participate in all the groups you're mentioning. The CD treatment, college classes, and also they have a dog program there, which was a huge, huge impact on my life, where we train service dogs to help. We have 4 dogs that come into the institution, and we train them to help disabled people, you know, out in the community, which was amazing. You know, that was an amazing program that taught me a lot too. But again, I transferred to Augsburg College last fall, and I transferred as a sophomore because all of my credits transferred from Shakopee. So that was just, I couldn't believe all those classes were real, you know? And you know, I shouldn't say, and affordable. You wouldn't believe what we pay for, I shouldn't even say, should I? Can I say how much they cost? It's $10 for a 4-credit class. I mean, my education, what a blessing, what a blessing.
So I tell the women, it's the cheapest, most expensive class you'll ever take. Because how much is your freedom worth?
Right.
Right? And so, you know, people will, in the community who I will talk to, I have to remind them that you have to be a convicted felon in a Minnesota prison to take a $10 class. So just keep that in mind. Thank you. Yes, thank you all. And I will say this, kind of in summary response, I feel very fortunate to work in our state system in comparison to other states. As far as education is concerned, we do have a tremendous amount of resources that we're able to bring to bear. That said, there are going to be situations like Gina's where logistically, you know, resource allocation just does not allow for every single person, depending on if they're not there long enough, which is sort of a double-edged sword. You know, I tell the women who are short, as they like to call it, you know, the good news is you're leaving soon. The bad news is you don't have enough time to do X, Y, or Z. So it is a mixed bag, but thankfully, post-incarceration, education had a huge impact on your life. Yay, education. All right, so the last couple things I want to just ask you about. First is, was there a point during, and it didn't necessarily have to be during incarceration, but it could have been, when you found your voice? You found sort of this energy about you and kind of reclaimed who you were. So sort of in the theme of what Amanda was talking about. It's one of the things that I notice when I see some of these women who I work with kind of transform. They sort of are finding their voice. From my perspective, that's what it looks like. So I'm wondering if there was a point, either during or post, that you sort of discovered your voice. Maybe we could start with you, Rhea.
For me, it was when I went to boot camp, well, CIP, Challenge Incarceration Program. In the beginning for boot camp, for me it was like, okay, I'm going to get time cut off my sentence. I got a long sentence. I'm just going to go and get it over with. But when I got there, because in my mind I was thinking it's all physical. I just got to run and I'm getting ready for it. I'm going to the gym every day, and that's not what it was. It was very mentally, I struggled really bad when I got there. I was always at a push-pull with all the sergeants and officers there. And then I think one day I just decided, I was outside cutting wood because I got in trouble, and it was wet wood because it just rained. And I was thinking while I was standing out there by myself away from everybody for probably the first time since I was incarcerated, I was just by myself. And I was like, you know, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep fighting these people that are trying to help me, and I need to ask for help. And probably maybe a week after that, we used to go to the horse ranch, and the guy that ran the horse ranch, he said this statement. He said, well, the 9 most powerful words in the English language are, I have a problem and I need your help. And when he said that to me, I was like, that's my problem. I never asked for help. Mm-hmm. And so since I've been out, that's been what I've been doing ever since I came home. I don't care, you know, how I feel about it, or, you know, how a person might look at me or whatever. It's just like putting that to the side and really asking for help.
I became HIV positive due to sex work and just living in the streets as a runaway, and I found that out when I was 19. And when I got to Shakopee at 25, I was told that now I had an AIDS diagnosis because I refused to take my medication. I refused to talk about it. I was in denial, even as I got sick every month with some little minor thing or another. So I think I realized at that moment that if I did die, it would be because I wasn't taking care of myself, not because of HIV. And I made the decision that I couldn't keep it a secret. So I was involved in a program called IFI, which is a large group of women, and you have like group therapy components. And part of that was telling your life story. And my biggest fear was for people to find out I had HIV and that no one would like me and no one would want to be my friend. So for days, I wrote my story, just crying and crying and crying and being terrified that all these women that I was connecting with and bonding with, that they would just shun me as soon as they found out. And I stood up in front of that class with tears streaming down my face the whole time, and I told everyone my secret. And then later on, people came and someone watched the guards so we could all hug each other in secret. And no one stopped being my friend. No one judged me. Everyone said, we love you and we want to be a support for you, and it could have been any one of us. And that was so freeing that when I left prison, I went on to become a public speaker, and I'm open with my HIV status, and I work for the Minnesota Department of Health in the HIV section. And it's been an amazing experience, and now I get to empower people who might be ashamed of their diagnosis. And it was just transformative for me.
Mine was in 2008 when Miss Andy Floor asked me to make a speech for the office support certificate. I got to go up in front of everyone at the graduation ceremony and give a little speech. And I couldn't believe that I had started something and finished it that was college level after my past education experience. It still is, I still have the diary, like I still have the book from that. And that's when I decided I was going to go back to school and I was going to make something of myself.
I had a spiritual experience when I was in prison. It was my 3rd trip to Shakopee, and I had never gone to Bible studies or never done any of that stuff in previous sentences or in county jail. I really believed that God was a crutch for weak-minded people. I had all these ideas about religion, and my mom gave my kids up for adoption while I was in Shakopee. My mom will be 70 the day that my son and daughter graduate from high school, and she went through Catholic Charities and got an adoptive home for my kids. And they went to live in Melrose, Minnesota. And I knew at that point I was at a crossroads. I had to decide if I was going to get my life together, and not if, but when my children came to find me, that I was going to be in a good place and that their pain and their life experience wouldn't be for nothing. Or was I just going to use it as an excuse to go out and keep sticking needles in my arm and hanging out with gangsters and being in abusive relationships? And, I decided at that point that I was going to try to do something different. And I went to this reentry class. It was about how to answer the felony question and how to get your driver's license back. And so I signed up for this class not knowing that it was a prison fellowship Bible study. I was so disgusted when I found out that that's what it was. And the rule at Shakopee is if you sign up for a class, you have to go or they put you on LOPs. So I'm stuck in this class and it's twice a week. And I started reading the scriptures that they gave me and coming back to class with questions. And at the end of that, I didn't care if the Bible was true or this God that they talked about was real. I just wanted to believe in anything the way that those Bible study teachers believed in the God that they served. And I asked them at the end of that 12-week class, how do I get what you have? And the Bible study teacher encouraged me to pray, and I didn't know anything about that. I just would go to bed at night and be like, dude, if you're for real, show me, because I had nothing. And Mother's Day 2002, I called home to wish my mom a happy Mother's Day, and she said, Gina, the kids are back home. After 11 months of having adopted my beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids, the people decided that it wasn't God's plan for their life to be parents. And in that moment in time, my life became different. The things that I had been reading in the Bible weren't just true, they were true for me. That I could be free and forgiven, that I could live a different life, that I could make my kids proud and make my mom proud. And so it was like a switch. I became worthwhile in the blink of an eye, and that changed everything. So.
Thank you all. So my final question, our kind of primary theme today, one of them certainly is hope. And so I'm just wondering in maybe 1 minute, if each of you could say, what is your hope for the women who are in Shakopee as we speak today?
One minute, huh? That's tough, because I have lots of things to say. I just got done, I guess I say just, but it's been 6 months ago, working on this. There's this organization that it's called Lifeblood, and they're starting a women's program in Shakopee, starting these classes, and they asked that same question about, what is your hope for the women that are watching this video? And, the change that happened in my life, and whether it's a cognitive decision or a spiritual experience, or for whatever reason that life becomes different for someone, when my life changed is when I decided that I was worth more than the needles I was putting in my arms, the crimes I was committing, and the terrible relationships that I was a part of. And so for me, I feel like that hope for people comes in that I love myself enough that I make a conscious decision every day to do the next right thing. And my hope for them is that that they would love themselves enough to make better decisions for themselves and their children and their futures. And to know that people like Mariah and I are out fighting that fight and being the voice when they don't have one of their own, to help people coming out of prison, or to sometimes just make sure they don't even end up in there.
For me, I would tell them, just don't give up. Don't give up. You'll get a lot of no's, or maybe never. You might never get a no, but more than likely because of that felony, you'll get a lot of no's. But if you don't give up, they'll turn to yeses.
Mine would be that I hope, like Gina says, that you can learn to love yourself. I too got the news when I was in prison that my daughter was being adopted by strangers, that my parents were done and they didn't believe that I would be a good mom. And unfortunately, my daughter hasn't come back to me, but I had to learn in that moment to do what I was doing for myself, because before I was doing everything for Mari, and realizing I was coming home just to Mariah. I had to learn to do things for myself and to love myself just because, and not because I was a mom. And so learning to love yourself, keep doing whatever you're doing in prison. You know, everyone's working on themselves. You're journaling, you're making these authentic connections. You have to keep it going on the outside because life starts happening and it's happening fast. And self-care is often the first thing to go. And it has to be a conscious decision. It's a conscious struggle to stay an emotionally healthy person and to live a life that you're proud of. And finally, I would just say it's never too late. I used to lie to myself and say it is too late for me. My credit is ruined, it's too late. Now I'm a homeowner. It's too late, I'm 25 and I have HIV, I'll never be able to get a relationship. Now I'm married. It's too late, I don't have any work history, now I have a career. It's never too late, those are lies that you tell yourself.
I really like what you said. She's like my mentor here. She's speaking to me. Definitely. I would say to be true to yourself, really to put yourself first, and to slow down. I know everybody wants to get out and just run, but take time for yourself, and it's never too late. You know, set goals. And I would suggest actually getting a mentor, like either through the Amicus program or Prison Ministries or IFI, and sponsor AANA, somebody that you can talk to. That first day when you get out too was really beneficial to me. And not to get in a relationship. That is really important. It was suggested to me, and I would suggest it to others. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you to all four of you. Yeah, let's give them a round of applause. So I believe we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. Okay, yep. And we have a hand there.
I know there was a restorative justice program at Shakopee, and I wonder if anybody was in that and what that was like.
Well, I know they do that in boot camp, right?
Right.
Yeah.
We had a restorative justice, actually a room, and we did, there was, well, you could make hats or blankets for the elderly. There was all sorts of projects that seemed like quarterly. I think we even bought some, did a fundraiser to buy some gravestones for the, do you remember that? There was a department called Restorative Justice that we did do things like that. The dog program is part of Restorative Justice, so that's the department I was in.
Could I say something about the gravestones? I know that story. Years ago, like 100 years ago, Shakopee was just an old farmhouse, and women who died while they were in the program were buried just under their prison ID number. And women at the prison found out about that and found 3 of these old graves and raised the money so that those forgotten women from 100 years ago could have gravestones with their own names on them.
Thank you.
Many of you mentioned when you were talking about your education that you wished there had been more like mental health resources for you growing up. Do you have any specific ideas or like opportunities and resources that you think would be beneficial in the schools and within Shakopee to like aid you further in that?
I've seen some really cool news articles about schools that are doing meditation instead of detention. I would fully support anything like that. And in Shakopee, I think that there was really, from my perspective, a lot of opportunities to work on your mental health and learning healthy coping skills. So I would just say keep it up.
And just like in contrast, you know, I've been, it'll be 14 years that I've been living a different life in July. And then another year before that, from when I got out of prison. And so I can just tell you guys this, that the system has grown in leaps and bounds in that area. I remember the last time that I was in Shakopee, I wanted to get a mental health assessment because I had never had one before. And I was 28 years old at that time, and in and out of prison, in and out of jail, in and out of treatment programs, never had a mental health assessment. And I waited on a waiting list for like 10 weeks to even be able to get an assessment. And that kind of thing happens now pretty easily within the system. And so I feel like as an industry, the Department of Corrections, especially in Minnesota, really understands that it's a chemical dependency issue, it's a mental health issue, and it's a criminal thinking issue. And so I think that they've come a long way in the last 15 years, for sure.
That reminded me of something. Also, what would it look like if we had trauma-informed care in the criminal justice system before sentencing? Because I shouldn't have been a first-time offender telling people I'm being beaten, I've been homeless for years, I've been doing sex work, I got a life-changing diagnosis, and for them to tell me that I'm antisocial and I never hear the word PTSD, like that was a missed opportunity. I shouldn't have been incarcerated as a first-time offender. I needed help. I didn't need these labels, and those labels, they didn't fit. You know, it was trauma, pure and simple. And, you know, people are too quick to say you have this or that disorder when really the women in Shakopee are traumatized, like everyone.
My question was a little bit along the lines, but I actually wanted to know, if possible, would you guys or anybody be willing to partner with local public schools? So a lot of you guys talked about trauma in your lives before the schools, but I volunteer at public school, and I also, as a girl, we had guidance counselors. And when I was in high school, we had a mediation breakout room. Now they have SRO officers, and your parent goes to court, and you automatically have a case open, and that starts at 6th grade. They have SRO officers in elementary schools. So when you guys mentioned like growing up, things that were going in your life, and if somebody was there or a counselor, I remember I had a guidance counselor, but my guidance counselor was geared to get me to college. And so what I'm wondering is, based on you guys' experiences, are you guys willing or maybe get help setting up a program? I would love to be a part of that. To work with high school and actually before high school, because especially as a girl, you guys are all women, so you know that your self-esteem changes probably like around 11, 12, or when you get your menstrual cycle. A lot of stuff happens with other girls. And so you don't really know yourself, and so you're really influenced by who you are around in your environment. And I'm just wondering, before high school, especially since there are SRO officers currently in our public school systems now, starting in elementary school. So elementary schools, kids are actually getting services. Are you guys willing, or how is there a way to start a program where you guys could go into the schools before you get to high school and talk to the students there? And maybe is there a way to get the women from the prisons to partner with schools? I know that may be kind of difficult, but if you don't try, it never happens. So I just was wondering how that can start.
So in 2006, when Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge hired me on, I was hired on through an earmark grant from the Department of Justice, Juvenile Delinquency Prevention. And I actually helped start a program called Know the Truth. It is a program that goes into 6th grade and up junior high, high school, to talk about addiction and mental health and self-esteem. The first year that I went out in the schools, I saw 12,000 kids in Minnesota and Wisconsin. This year, that team has seen 60,000 kids. And they do small groups. They break them up with boys and girls and talk about all of that kind of stuff. And so if you're interested in having a conversation about that, and I just, for one, am always interested in going out and sharing my story. If it can change anybody's life, then it makes mine a little bit more worth it, so.
I'm open to chatting with anyone afterwards that has similar things they'd want to do. I'm a very active volunteer, and I rarely say no, so.
Me as well.
Yes.
Hi, I just want to say thank you. This is a phenomenal session, and we're so grateful for your openness in talking about your experience. My name is Barb Frey. I'm on the board of an organization called Children of Incarcerated Caregivers, which is here locally, and I'd love it if you could comment on whether your children visited you in prison or what you observed about your fellow women who had children visit. If you could talk about visitation a little bit and what your opinions about that are and your observations.
For me, I was in the Anthony building, the Anthony program, which is the kids building where I think way, way back kids used to come in and spend the night, because you can still see there's like the extra bed down there. But when I was there, my daughter got to come in, and we would do this big thing in the gym. There was like, different activities, coloring, and they would stay for about, I think it was 4 to 6 hours, and that was like once a week. So that was pretty awesome for her to be able to come in, and we'd eat lunch and everything. So, I mean, I'm very thankful for that, so.
I don't have children, but some of my friends also participated in the Anthony program, which, exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
My daughter learned how to read at 3 in the Shakopee Women's Prison Visiting Room. It's a make or break for a lot of women. With the CPS, Child Protective System, what it is, you have 6 months if a child's under 6, and a year to get them back into your custody before they start working towards permanency. I have a whole bunch of opinions about that if you'd like to listen to them. And so it's tough. I mean, it really is a pretty sore subject. Somebody asked about if the other girls are jealous that people get to be involved in choir, and I know them spots at Anthony, at the Anthony building are in pretty high demand, and so it's a hard thing. Kids, it's a hard thing. They wonder why men go to treatment so much more often than women, and it's because who's going to take care of the kids if they go? And so it's definitely part of, I feel like, the problem in our criminal justice system, the way that CPS and treatment and the criminal justice system works to break families up. They're not for families. They work against it, and especially with men going to prison, and that's the primary caregiver, and they take away that income, and then wives and women and families. It's especially prevalent in the African American community, and it's really sad.
As being newly released, and you all formerly being residents of Shakopee, what are some advice that you can give to myself as well as other women being released as far as volunteer opportunities within the community for those of us that are on paper but that want to give back, as well as maybe some housing options and just some advice about things like that to kind of relieve some of the anxieties of women that are being
released and reentering society.
And this is going to have to be our last question, but we have a couple minutes to answer that question.
I've got, just like to briefly share my experience. I had 96 hours of community service to do because I was released from boot camp also, and I decided to make it meaningful. I just didn't want to do something to get it done, and it was by volunteering at the Minnesota AIDS Project that I started my career, which has led me to where I am now. I couldn't even get a minimum wage job, and yet I got into that field by volunteering. So I would just say Minnesota is the land of nonprofits, and there is so many opportunities. So finding that thing you're passionate about, that might very well open up into a career for you. And also the human service field can be welcoming to people with a felony conviction. It depends on if you need to get clearance by the Department of Human Services or not, which I can talk to you afterwards also. But then my advice too is just stick with it, and be willing to cut people off. If you find yourself going down that slippery slope, you have to be willing to step back and say, no, I can't do this. I have to take care of myself first.
I would say get a therapist right away. Like, seriously, because I know that shell shock of being out, like my anxiety was like being around people, and like, you know, it's a big shift, especially if you did a lot of time. But a therapist is a big one, in a support group, whether it's AA, NA, just, you know, I mean, I didn't really like AA or NA when I first got out, but I mean, you meet people and they can give you resources to other things or whatever, so.
I would say too, like, while you're thinking straight right now, and like, obviously you're looking to do positive things, because here you are, get a notebook, 10 people you can hang out with, 10 people you should stay away from, 10 places you should be going, 10 places you got no business going. Establish some boundaries, some self-allocated boundaries, because then when you start feeling off, you can go back and look and see, like, what am I doing that maybe I shouldn't be doing? No boys. Boys are bad right now. Boys are bad right now for like the next 9 months to a year. You know, you think about where you're at on paper, looking for work, housing, all that stuff. The kind of man you're going to attract right now is not the one you're looking for. I promise you that. And find a mentor, a sponsor, somebody that, for me, being as codependent as I am, and I am codependent, if I don't have somebody to call and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Then it ends up being a relationship that I'm looking towards. And, you know, you establish some boundaries for yourself. If your mom or your dad, or you have somebody that kind of brings up that yuck in you, you need to limit the time that you spend with them, you know? And I guess the only other thing that I would say is don't go back to where you came from. East Side, Rice Street, South Side, wherever it is that you came from, you got no business over there, not even to shop. Stay away until you're strong, so.
I agree with Gina, definitely about don't go back to the same area. And there's always sober homes. You know, there's no background check on sober homes. So it's not like getting an apartment or renting a house. So I would check out sober homes.
Breaking Free is an organization that helps people who have been involved with sex work. Don't know if that's the situation or not, but for anyone who has that, they have amazing support groups and housing and other resources also.
Well, thank you. What a great panel.
Okay, thank you. So this is our last panel, and it's made up of professionals who work in the field, and I just have to say we have tough acts to follow with the previous presentations. And then I do want to, mention that after this there'll be time to talk and follow up. So if you didn't get your questions answered, there will be time for that afterwards. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to begin by introducing themselves and then how they work in this area of women in the criminal justice system. And then I have some questions, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience as well. So Jim, I'll start with you.
All right, well, my background, I went to school to be a college professor and took a slight detour into prison when Joan Costello, who was the dean at Inver Hills, where I was teaching, said, got some opportunities for you in the prison program. And so I did that. And one of the first things that struck me was sort of this nagging question of now what? So I was at Oak Park Heights, Stillwater, and Shakopee, and I just remember coming away from teaching classes and thinking, the crime has been committed, the sentence has been executed, and now here he or she sits. Now what? What are they going to do? The DOC mission is all about reducing recidivism and promoting change. How are people going to change, and what kind of part can I play in that? So as an educator, it was sort of a natural draw for me. And so I got involved for a few years, and then an opportunity came along to oversee the higher education program at Stillwater and Shakopee. So I did that for a couple years. And during one of the discussions we had, I had one of those defining moments where one of the men at Stillwater, we were talking about rehabilitation, and he said, we don't need rehabilitation, we need habilitation. And I thought, what does he mean by that? And so we had this discussion about his upbringing and life skills and all of the things that many of us sort of had by default and sort of take for granted. And that was a real defining moment for me. Another one was spending some time at Shakopee and realizing, as Amanda talked about, that women have a different pathway, that they get to prison in a different way than the men do. And then the last thing in that regard was I realized early on, working in both men's facilities and women's facilities, that women needed advocates. And it makes sense. Again, as Amanda pointed out, it's 5 to 7% of any sort of jurisdiction is going to be women. And so, of course, the attention is going to be on men. And so as a result, women sometimes do get overlooked. And so they need advocates, and they don't just need women advocates, they need men advocates too. Right now, 4 of our 8 facilities have women wardens, including Shakopee. But I think both men and women professionals have roles to play, was something else that sort of struck me. So moving forward then, I had an opportunity in 2002 to become the education director at Shakopee, again, kind of the school principal. And that's been just an amazing experience. I did that for a while and then went out in the private sector, and now I'm back. And one of the things that has really struck me is this idea that as much as we can, bringing the community into the facility with all of these pro-social kinds of things, so that making the transition isn't as much of a shock to people, and back to the point of habilitation, things that people haven't been exposed to. So in Minnesota, for example, we have 10,000 Things. Some of you may be familiar with Michelle Hensley and the theatrical program that she has, and taking theater into non-traditional sort of areas. So things like that. And the choir, I have a musical background, came from a musical family, and a staff actually approached me and said, can you do something with this choir? It was 4 women and a karaoke machine. That's not choir. So yes, serendipitously we had Amanda, and the rest is history. So, and the last thing I'll just say is, lately I've been thinking a lot in the work that I do about things that really kind of came out of what the women were just talking about, which is really this idea of agency, finding a voice, realizing that I am worth it, the things that they talked about, that it's a remarkable thing to watch the transformation of a woman who's incarcerated when she finds her voice, when she realizes she has something to give back to the world, and that she's worth it, and that she does need to do self-care. and that education plays a huge part in that from my perspective. And then that ties into this whole idea of identity. Who am I? The last thing I'll say is one of the favorite things that I get to do is meet with the women who are newly arrived at the facility. So every other Monday, I have a half hour with this group. And the first thing I do is I tell them I'm a teacher, and so I'm going to have to ask you a question, and I'm going to warn you it's a trick question. And I ask them, when does an offender become an ex-offender? So we have this discussion about this term that a lot of people find very offensive. And ultimately, what I'm trying to get them to think about is that that's a term that refers to something that you did that brought you here to this room. And so to not have that label is to start thinking differently about who you are. That you're a mom, you're a sister, you're a daughter, you're all these things that Amanda talked about in her talk as well, and that the women have brought up. And so just trying to get them to think about every morning when you put your clothes on, you don't have to put that label on the way you put your state issue clothing on. You can put all these positive pro-social labels on that are meaningful and that are important to you. So that's a little bit about me and kind of where I'm coming from and the work that I do.
That's a really hard introduction to follow, Jim. So my name is Rebecca Schleifer. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics here at the medical school. I'm a self-proclaimed nerd. I like data. I do research. I have been involved in this area, working with children and families and mothers affected by incarceration for more than 10 years now. It started when I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin. Actually, I was tasked with going around taking focus group notes, what seemed like a very boring job at the time, taking focus groups notes about grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. And I remember at that time hearing these really incredible stories of resilience, grandparents who are doing really tough jobs, while they were struggling with their own children who were in and out of the criminal justice system. So they had taken on often these very temporary, chaotic roles of parenting again, often on times with sometimes their own substance abuse issues, their own chronic health conditions, their own mental health conditions. And many of them were doing really, really well, despite all of the things that were happening, and some of them weren't. And for me, I really started down this path of what's happening in families when kids have parents who are involved in the criminal justice system. I stayed at Wisconsin to continue doing some work with mentoring children of prisoners at the time when that had come down through the Bush administration, and didn't just continue to stay on this path around children and families affected by incarceration. So I do a lot of work down at Shakopee. I'm the research director for the Minnesota Prison Doula Project. We provide pregnancy and parenting support to incarcerated women. I've led a number of projects in the state where we've been trying to put some numbers on this problem. So I started by telling you I'm a data dork. One of the challenges that we've had in Minnesota is knowing the scope of this problem. And I have really worked hard over the last several years to collaborate with the Department of Corrections to try to understand how many mothers are there at Shakopee, right? So Amanda said in her introduction, 76% of them. We didn't know that until just a couple years ago. We didn't know how many kids there were with a parent currently in prison in our state. And so I sort of see my role around advocacy as bringing awareness through numbers and helping people understand the scope of the problem and how that's impacting children, families, and communities in the state of Minnesota.
I'm Bruce Peterson. I've been a judge in Hennepin County for 18 years, and I have had the pleasure of hearing voices of hope. A year ago at the graduation, Jim asked me to come out and talk to the graduates, and I think you did I Am Becoming. And I don't think there was a dry eye in the whole place. It really is an inspirational program, and the voices of those women was so beautiful. And I also want to say Jim has created a really supportive, nurturing, hopeful program at Shakopee. The educational opportunities, which you heard some of here, are really terrific. I wanted to quote something because the latest book I'm reading is The Untethered Soul. Anybody know of this book? It's just wonderful. Michael Singer. And this inspirational, Amanda said that the path to prison for women almost always involves trauma. And that's the common denominator of, I think, virtually all the women I've seen in the criminal justice system. And healing trauma involves confronting and encompassing pain. And I think you can see what these women today have done for themselves. What Mr. Singer says is when you're comfortable with pain passing through you, you will be free. The world will never be able to bother you again, because the worst the world can do is hit the pain stored within you. If you do not care, if you're no longer afraid of yourself, you are free. You'll then be able to walk through the world more vibrant and alive than ever before. You'll feel everything at a deeper level. You'll begin to have truly beautiful experiences rise up within you. Eventually, you will understand that there is an ocean of love behind all of this fear and pain. And what I've seen is that women who come through this finding a voice end up stronger and more loving and more compassionate than many of us who have not had to confront ourselves in that way. So I'm just so inspired by what you had to say, and as representatives of people who have gone through this process. So my own path is, I said I've been on the bench 18 years. I think probably the first 10 or 12 years, I had a very naive view that I simply avoided sending women to prison if I could possibly think of a way not to, on the assumption that they are often a primary caretaker, that the public safety issues are not the same for women. Frankly, our guidelines that women don't commit the kind of violent crimes that usually end up somebody in prison early on. So I had kind of a simplistic notion of avoid this whenever possible. Then I was asked to manage 3 of our problem-solving courts. We have 6 or 7 in Hennepin County, and I think, Mariah, they're our answer to try to accomplish what you said we should, which is provide supportive therapeutic environments for women before they go to prison. They are, people know what, is this a common term, problem-solving or therapeutic courts? We have a drug court, a DWI court, a mental health court, a veterans court. I managed courts for women charged with prostitution and for homeless offenders. They're gateways to services. The courtroom is full of service providers. We see the participants regularly, provide supportive encouragement to them. A kind of, the judge becomes kind of a mentor, motivator figure. The problem with typical judging is you never see what happens. You send somebody to prison, you never know anything again. If you put somebody on probation, you find out if things go bad because they come back, but you never find out what succeeds and why. And the terrific advantage and experience for a problem-solving court judge or a therapeutic court judge is you see everybody every week, and you know exactly what's happening, and you get to know people very well. And originally in drug court, some of the treatment professionals convinced me that there were times when it was better for a woman to be separated from her children. That there were times, I would say she's got children, it's got to be outpatient treatment. By the way, when we're talking about resources that are needed, I know of only 2, you probably know of more, Gina, I know of only 2 family inpatient treatment programs in this county, Wayside Family and Eden Family, where women can go with children and be in inpatient treatment. So they're very limited spots. Do you have any? Does Teen Challenge have any?
We don't do women with children. There's another program that opened in Mora called Recovering Hope.
Okay.
There also is Metro Hope Ministries runs a program. It's not clinical treatment though. It's faith-based called Healing House. But you're right, Judge Peterson, there are very few.
So the spaces are limited, but I was convinced there were times when it was that if a woman was an IV meth user, that she was not being an effective mother anyway. And so I got used to the idea of times when it was just necessary to separate a woman from her children. And then I was asked to take over our calendar for women charged with prostitution. And we had a wonderful on that, I'm not managing it anymore, but a wonderful probation officer on that calendar who she was a combination of a mother and a mentor and a cheerleader and an enforcement officer, but She got to know these women very, very well. And she convinced me that there are times when we should, now misdemeanors in Hennepin County are typically prostitution offenses are typically misdemeanors or gross misdemeanors, so they're not felonies that would wind up with somebody at Shakopee. But she convinced me that we should be sending people on occasion to the Hennepin County Workhouse, which is for sentences less than a year, short-term sentences, for people who were at risk for their lives. In fact, we did have, while I was there, a woman who she was beaten to death while she was participating in this court. Her behavior was just out of control. So Cheryl would recommend on occasion that women, the level of trauma sometimes gets so great, the impulse control is so low, the anxiety is that women, they can't stay put, they can't stay in a program, they can't follow through. So we had women who went to the Hennepin County Workhouse who came back and said that was the best thing he ever did for me, because I would see what happened. We would ask them to participate in a combination of programs, inpatient drug treatment called Telesis at the workhouse, a program done by Pride, which is very similar to Breaking Free, a women's empowerment group, and a COG skills class of some kind, often beyond trauma. And fortunately, Gina, at the workhouse, we could, people could go through those programs in 6 or 7, even 4 or 5 months sometimes. It didn't require a full year. And so I became convinced that there were times when the level of trauma and distress was such that just, I have to say one thing, the men's section at the Hennepin County Workhouse is large and loud. The women's section is small and quiet. And there are very nurturing people there who will work with women. So we had some very hopeful successes with women who spent 4, 5, 6 months out there and came back and were able then to function in more of the normal setting we were working in. I'm very inspired by the stories I've seen and heard myself now from women like yourselves who have found their voice. And I think our job as a society is to find the safe, nurturing, maybe structured environments where women can go through that process of facing and encountering that pain from that trauma and getting through it and finding this sunshine on the other side, which you've seen here today. So thank you again for talking to us.
Hametakiapi, oasin shantawashte anape chiuzapie, ake wupire chichiapie. Thank you guys so much for what you were saying earlier and for coming up and speaking for us. I really do appreciate it. I'm Mwakpetuan Dakota from a reservation about 2.5 hours west of here. And my journey to doing work in prison, I volunteer with the Minnesota Prison Doula Project, which is awesome. Is simultaneously very roundabout, but also very logical. I was born into a family of academics, a family of anti-colonial and decolonization activists, and anarchists. And so growing up within that place, what I came to understand was the importance of context and the histories thousands of years deep that bring people to where they currently are in the places that they currently are. And I understood something from the time that I was 6 years old, that when towns on the west frontiers were being founded, 2 buildings went up first in every single township, and the first one was always a jail. I know the history of incarceration in this country, specifically as it relates to indigenous populations. And I know that in terms of bodies, indigenous populations have always been the most expendable, the most able to be incarcerated, the most worthless in this country. And so I kind of knew that growing up, and yeah, it was just kind of, it was my dining room table talk. When I decided to become a midwife, I was kind of entranced by this idea of the miracle of birth and the wonderful, fluffy connotations we all have with that. And something that was a great part of my maturing process as I was entering my late teens and early 20s was this realization that midwives have historically been not just baby catchers, but the people who are the last line of defense for women and children. That motherhood is an incredibly complicated affair. And sometimes what we think what should be best isn't necessarily always what is best in a given situation. And I tried to volunteer with what was then ISIS Rising, and that's a different issue, who was providing doula services for incarcerated women at that time, and it didn't end up working out. But what I kind of came to, when I really decided to take up the work, actually my then partner, current husband, was incarcerated for a while, and one time when I was visiting him, they had children in the room, in the large visiting room, and it was time for us to go. And so, they lined up all of the visitors on one side and all of the inmates had to stand up against the wall on the other side. And there was this little boy who started crying for his daddy. He did not understand. He was 3. He did not understand why they had to leave, and he was sobbing for his daddy. And there was not a dry eye in that place because we all had to watch them leave. And it was in that moment that I really decided that in order to be an advocate, in order to actually be a midwife, it was utterly my duty to be a voice for and an advocate for that line of defense for women and children. Because that is a holy and sacred bond that we have, and it's really about trying to get families to be able to be the best they possibly can be, whatever that looks like. And so with the Minnesota Prison Doula Project, I've had the opportunity to be the one person who can absolutely hug an inmate. I'm the one person who gets to cuddle them and give them hugs and help them hold their babies for the first time when they have them. And I'm also the person there who watches them and sits there with them while they watch their babies taken from them. And I can't lie, that's rugged. And there's something really deep inside me that is altered with that. And so it was kind of through that process that, again, logically, anarchist, decolonization activist, that I totally became a prison abolitionist. Because there are deeper societal issues that we need to address, and so yes, they may serve a social function. But ultimately, we need to fix those social issues so those situations, those separations, those re-traumatizations don't need to happen anymore. There we go.
Thank you for your introductions. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned here today is the racial disparities in incarceration. And I'm going to ask Jim and Autumn to speak to this and briefly, because I do have a bunch of questions that I want to get through. But Jim, if you could share the disparities in indigenous populations in Shakopee, and Autumn, if you could speak to why do we see those disparities?
Well, I can certainly just comment on what the reality is. And when I looked this morning, 23% of the Shakopee population self-identify as Native American, American Indian. And if you look at Minnesota's population, I believe it's about 1.1% of the adult population identifies. So then if you cut that in half, you just sort of do the basic math, you're looking at maybe 0.5% of the general adult population in the state is Native American. And so 0.5% compared to 23%, I think you can do the basic math. And so those of us who work there, it's a reality. And I hope that Autumn can have, lend some more perspective on that. I know it's a deep, complicated, complex issue. The work that we try to do at Shakopee, we have an amazing chaplain who supports the Native women to the best of her ability through smudging and different things and bringing in volunteers. But it has been a challenge for a very long time. This isn't something that just happened, a couple years ago. We've struggled in the department, and at Shakopee with how to provide services and what that should look like, and trying to recruit volunteers. It's a battle and it's a struggle.
As far as I know, the first incarceration of Indigenous women in this state was in 1862, when around 1,400 women, children, and elders were held in a concentration camp outside of Fort Snelling. Among their population was one of my grandmothers, and on the forced march to get there, she watched her grandmother, who was a midwife, bayoneted in the stomach by a white soldier as they arrived there. The history of incarceration, specifically with Indigenous people around here, is really long and it's really deep, and at least in its origin was directly rooted in the attempts to disenfranchise and oppress a population in order to extract resources. Following that, understanding that women are the backbones of any community, because again, we're talking about mothers and caregivers and the people who are always around even when no one else is, the backbones here. They were actually targeted directly by government policy in order to alter their behaviors, to change what they were actively doing in any given situation, and then also to incarcerate them. So this is a history, right? This isn't something that just kind of appeared, and it's not something, a rate at which that we're usually even, we shouldn't even be surprised to see, right? Also, up until very recently, within the last couple of generations, there's been a huge language barrier with many Indigenous populations. There are still people around who don't speak English. And so when you're trying to explain to them that something's going wrong, you know, it's very easy to see how that situation can get out of hand. Anyone who does research in historical trauma will know that the effects of that trickle down through several generations and frequently manifest in self-destructive behavior, something that we could also categorize as antisocial, right? It is correlated with drug abuse, it's correlated with domestic violence, it's correlated with sexual violence, it's correlated with a whole host of other things. You combine that with rural poverty living, poor nutrition, all kinds of different factors that then end up landing people where they are. And so while it's very easy to attribute things to individual situations, individual symptoms of drug abuse and sex work and risky behavior, I think it's really important to back up a little and look at the historical context that all of those things happen in, because all of this stuff doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It comes as a direct result of social and historical circumstance.
Emily, can I offer? Autumn knows a lot more about this than I do, but I can just offer another little bit of perspective. In the problem-solving courts I've managed, our graduation rate with Native Americans, both men and women, is the worst by far of any identified group. And I have been frustrated. I know Hennepin County officials have been frustrated and concerned about our ability to provide culturally specific services for Native Americans. The probation system, the treatment system, the mental health system, they all make certain assumptions about what people will need to do to get better, to succeed. Be a self-advocate. One of the things that struck me is Native Americans in court, they don't stick up for themselves. They will not argue for their, why they should get a better break. Family matters. We have had a real problem with Native Americans in treatment doing well, and then they get a call that there's a need from a family member on the reservation someplace, and they go. And the whole system, our organizational system, depends upon punctuality and compliance, and having people go back and forth winds up with more violations. Even a lot of our therapeutic processes are group processes that assume people will share their feelings in public. And that is something that often is antithetical to some Native cultural traditions. So we need to do just a much better job of adjusting our services and our whole delivery system to the cultural needs of Native Americans.
Just one more real quick. two things that are happening at Shakopee. One is white bison, which some folks might be familiar with. And then another is a partnership that is evolving with Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. So some efforts are being made.
No, absolutely, and I do want to clarify that there are some really great efforts at Shakopee. Though I think one of the reasons that programming directed toward Native people really struggles is this idea that there's a Native American programming, rather than acknowledging that there are 500 autonomous indigenous nations, each with their own languages and traditions and cultures and family values. And so just putting Native American doesn't work, because I know that when I had to go through Ojibwe programming, no disrespect to the Anishinaabe folks, it was not at all relevant to anything that I was or was coming at it with. And so it just feels increasingly marginalized to be in Native programming that doesn't actually address who you are.
Thank you. So Rebecca, what are the needs of incarcerated mothers? What are the needs, and then what also can prisons do? And I'm curious, because sometimes we hear about, having programs where kids should spend the night, or prison nurseries, or those kind of things, and I'm interested in your opinion on those types of things.
Yeah, thanks, Ebony. That's a complicated question, and I always say it depends, right? It depends on a lot of things, including how old the children are. So most incarcerated women have, on average, 2 children, and those kids are of different ages. And so when I think about what does a pregnant mom need, or what does a mom with a baby, a brand new baby, the moms that we support who give birth while they're in custody, that infant needs something different than what the 13-year-old needs, right, when he or she is coming to visit his or her mom. I think we know that kids can thrive. We know that incarcerated parents do better when they are getting consistent, regular visitation. Unfortunately, our correction system, not just here in Minnesota, but all across the country, is not conducive to family support, right? And so we can think about the Anthony program that offers a better opportunity for...
And I don't mean to cut you off, but can you describe the Anthony program?
Yeah.
We've tossed it around, but I don't know if we know exactly what it is.
Yeah, so the Anthony program is a privileged living unit within the Shakopee Women's Prison, where women can live in that unit if they are discipline-free, and agree to not use swear words and participate in programming. And they have an opportunity to get extended visits with their children over the weekend. So you talk about, and not overnight, but on Saturday for about 4 hours, come in. Kids can share a meal with their mom. There are some group-based activities in the gym, as we heard about, and other one-on-one time when moms can just get on the floor and play with their kids, right, in a much more natural environment than what the visiting space offers at Shakopee. And so when we think about those being environments in which we know kids can reconnect with their moms, that's really important time, but that's not what most of our correctional facilities look like in the state of Minnesota or across the country. Frankly, most correctional facilities don't offer any kind of contact visiting, and even when kids do come to visit their moms within the Anthony unit and they get this extended time, that's some of the only opportunity that kids can sit on their mom's lap, that moms can hug and kiss their kids, and to think about any other visiting environment where moms can't hug or hold their kids is really runs counter to what we know about family support and what moms need. So I think about visiting contact. This came up earlier with regard to the child protection system. It's an incredibly complicated system, and most of the moms that we're working with have really very limited understanding of where they are in the child protection system. And often the child protection system timelines are run very contradictory to the prison timelines. And there's just not a lot of coordination to help moms and families navigate that system while a person is incarcerated. And that's not just unique to moms, but because most of them are primary caregivers before they go to prison, and the overwhelming majority of them plan to return to caregiving roles when they get out, this idea that we're gonna just cut them off from parenting while they're incarcerated, it doesn't do any good for moms, and it's really, really profoundly damaging to children.
And Rebecca and Jim, I don't know if you want to briefly talk about the visiting room out in Shakopee and what that looks like and what you've done to make it more family-friendly.
I can just tell you a couple practical things. There's a space, I know some of you have been there, and we have some Shakopee staff here, but there's a space that would be kind of the southern part of the visiting room that was painted, I like to call it the Shrek or Dr. Seuss green. And we also, I think the thought was through Rebecca's guidance and expertise, let's try to make it as much like an early literacy center, early learning center as we could, or like a pediatric doctor's office. And so we did some ABCs, 1, 2, 3, shapes, that kind of thing. And then you can certainly talk about other things that we brought in or resources.
Yeah, so I think part of it is, for folks who aren't familiar, the visiting environment at Shakopee is not unlike other places across the country, where if you go to have a contact visit with the person you're visiting, you're sitting across in a chair with a couple feet in between you and your visitor. And children need to be under control. I don't know how many of you have young children, but certainly mine aren't under control, and wouldn't be if they were asked to be sitting across from me if that was the first time we had spent time together in some time. And so one of the thoughts is really how do we create this environment where moms and their kids can do something together, they can read, they can play I Spy with what's on the wall. I think the steps that we've taken at Shakopee are really good first steps, and we've described them as low-hanging fruit, but there's so much more that could be done. And again, when we think about the systemic inequities that are driving disparities and mass incarceration, we really have to think about the fact that most incarcerated moms don't get visits, don't get face-to-face visits with their kids. And that's because we have one women's prison and everybody has to come to that one prison. And I'm certainly not advocating for more. I'm actually thinking about where could we put those moms closer to their communities so that they could serve their time, or alternative sentencing. Because what's happening is that families can't consistently get to Shakopee. So I want to see the visiting room get better, but I'd also like to see fewer moms visiting their kids in that space altogether. And that's hard because the environment is only so good if you can get there.
And let me just add from a reality standpoint, at Shakopee, about 2/3 of the women are not from the 7-county metro area. So just kind of give that a little perspective. And the men, it's almost the inverse.
So I'm wondering if each of you could speak briefly to what are the challenges. So a lot of the public and academics really don't know. We don't study women in crime as much as we do men in crime. So what are the challenges related to women in the criminal justice system, women in either sentencing or incarceration? What are the challenges that we should know about? And if you want to speak to how they're different than men. So let's start with Autumn, and then we'll just work our way down.
I'm going to assume you mean outside of the whole colonial, racist, imperial system that gets people there.
Call it like it is.
Right.
Don't mince words.
I'm not known for mincing words. I think advocacy is a really, really important thing that we need more of. We need more people aware about the issues. We need more people who, well, not even just aware. We need people who care enough to be mobilized around them. We need communities who are willing to not stigmatize incarceration and to help people get back on their feet when they come out. And specifically in regards to women, I think going back to like bigger, broader issues, we need, kind of following up on points that have been brought up earlier, we need really, really good, solid consent training starting at around kindergarten. We need good relationship skills. We need good mental health support starting not already when there's a problem, but before there ever could be a problem. We want to start talking about those issues with kids. I recently read a survey saying, something about 70% of American adults say that their first sexual experience was embarrassing and shameful. Right? Versus like in places where they start consent and relationship training in kindergarten, where they say 95% of people say their first experience was positive and an overwhelmingly empowering experience. And so what good, healthy relationships look like? How do we establish those things? And also really being staunch advocates and active advocates in the rights of mothers and children, I think across the board, making sure that people who have children are well supported economically so they don't have to resort to doing crazy things in order to put food on the table for their kids. And really just being better as a society about supporting women and children.
Is that what you want, is solutions, good ideas?
Yes, I think,
Okay.
yes.
So let's recognize that we have a fundamental limitation in our view of crime and the criminal justice system, which is, if there's a crime, we assume that one person or co-defendants are responsible for it. And therefore, we don't really look at the social circumstances that we know will predictably produce crime. The individual responsibility myth is a very convenient way of absolving all of us from the conditions that created the crime. We know about conditions. We're learning more and more about the relationship between trauma and crime. How many people know about the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences? It's becoming more and more a tool of criminal justice professionals. All our judges have been trained in it now. I could tell you the details, but essentially, there's a well-established correlation between the level and amount of adverse childhood experiences and mental, physical, social, criminal justice results. And you can actually do a score. It's very easy to score. I start to score the people I see, and they all have these very high scores, which means there's 5, 10 times as likely that someone will become drug addicted or will be not just perpetrate domestic violence, but trauma leads to victimization of domestic violence. So I think as we shift away from the myth of individual responsibility and become more aware of social conditions, you hear about the school to prison pipeline, things like that, and the inevitable effect of childhood trauma on adult criminal behavior, we have an entry point to address the issue that's different from punishment.
I'm with that. And I think that's a really nice segue into thinking about the fact that one of the adverse childhood experiences is the incarceration of a household member, right? And that particular ACE very rarely travels alone because it brings with, when a parent is incarcerated, children have often already been exposed to violence in the home, a parent with a substance abuse problem, homelessness or high mobility. And so for kids whose parents are involved in the criminal justice system, they on average have something like 4 ACEs, right? So when we think about breaking these cycles and we consider what do we need to be doing to support children and families, to me, and I've said this before publicly, so I can, I don't think I can get in any more trouble than I said it the first time, like to have a single parenting coordinator at Shakopee Women's Prison when 76% of the 700 women that are there are mothers with minor children, to me, speaks about priorities. And I don't know how we expect to break these cycles of intergenerational incarceration and intergenerational patterns unless we really begin to invest in the fact that the majority of women that are there are parents with minor children, and they are going to return to caregiving roles. So if we expect to intervene on this cycle, we have to begin by recognizing and investing in those relationships and investing in their children. And that only goes so far if you have one person whose responsibility that is at Shakopee.
I think Rebecca sometimes enjoys getting in trouble. But that's okay.
Not really.
No. So I guess to sort of piggyback off of everything that's been said, and I will again reiterate, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Corrections. I'm just speaking on behalf of my own personal experience and academic training. But the 2 things that come to mind when it comes to solutions for me are, number 1, my supporting area of study in graduate school was public health. And there are professionals in public health who have begun to put the public health lens on the criminal justice system, and in particular on incarceration. Ernest Drucker's work and others have done a lot of work. Epidemiology has some very powerful tools to help us with solutions. Look at tobacco, look at HIV, look at all these things that have epidemics that we have faced. And there's some pretty powerful stuff in public health, which leads me to, again, my own personal opinion, which is I think as a department and as many departments, we're sort of halfway there. We have a very good emphasis in our mission statement on reducing recidivism. But in my view, we need to raise the bar. Just because someone doesn't come back to prison doesn't mean they're living a healthy, vital, successful life. So I did a little of my own little research and reminding myself of some graduate work. 1948, the World Health Organization defined health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And so you can hear from our panel of women, they're not just staying out of prison, they're actually leading vital, productive lives, healthy, they're engaged in things that we would define as successful, right? And so I think we need to raise the bar and finish the equation, the other half of the equation, which is, and I'll just start with education because that's my area, people need to be educated and they need to be employed and they need to be sober and they need to, all these things that we've been talking about. So for me, solutions start with the public health lens and all of the epidemiological tools that we have at a place like the School of Public Health here, where I took courses a while back, and also maybe thinking about the next evolution of our mission as a department and other departments around the nation to go just beyond reducing recidivism, talking about health and well-being and not merely the absence of incarceration or rearrest or resentencing.
Thank you. So now I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. I have a ton more questions, but I want to give you guys the opportunity to ask questions too. I think we could have had a day-long session on this. So there's a question right in the middle.
So I'm a student at the School of Public Health, so I will bounce off of what you're saying. And when you talked about raising the bar, I was hoping you would go here, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what prevention would look like, even if it would mean putting some of you out of a job eventually.
Well, I'll just say very briefly, those of us, and I have some colleagues here at Shakopee, we're at the back end. And so I don't feel like I have enough expertise. I would defer more to Rebecca and Autumn in particular, and perhaps the judge.
Well, I think prevention looks like all the core public health things that we know, right? It is safe and affordable housing. It's a living wage. It is education. And we know that there are really reliable predictors. When we think about the social determinants of health, those factors are the very same thing that drive incarceration in our country. But that requires a societal investment on those factors. And that is, to Jim's point, they're on the back end of it, right? And that is, they're dealing with a population that is continuing to rise, and their job isn't to make sure that, everybody has a living wage, but it starts with basic things like clerical certificates, right? So I think it is related for sure, but it is so much bigger than one women's prison.
And let me just real quick, floating around social media, some of you may have seen the whole Portugal thing. I don't know, does that sound familiar to anybody? If you have 10 days or less supply of drugs, you're given the opportunity to go to treatment voluntarily, or you just get a very low level sort of sanction or fine. And it's floating around social media. We need to decriminalize drugs. But if you back up and you talk to the architect of that in the Portuguese government, his whole message is it's a public health model. It's all of these things that have to support that. You can't just say, well, let's decriminalize drugs by saying 10 days, 15, whatever. You're clearly just a user, you're not a dealer, so treatment is really the answer for you. Well, we need more treatment programs then, right? You can't just change the law and have judges who are being creative without having all these other things and spending our money differently. So I just wanted to mention that because I don't know, I've seen a lot of things lately about Portugal and how they're so successful since 2001.
Does the public health education track include criminal justice issues? Is that even linked in your education?
If you seek those opportunities out yourself.
Because I would say that Jim put his finger right on it, the antidote to the individual responsibility myth is the public health view of, what are the conditions that, just like any lack of health, what are the conditions that produce it? And I think virtually every state has done an ACEs study now, and most states, including Minnesota, have done the second step. We now know what causes, the effect of adverse experiences. How do we address them? And I think if you look at ACEs and resilience creation, I think most states have a program set out of what communities could do. Obviously, safe, nurturing environments. I think opportunities for children to feel a sense of efficacy, to feel the positive relationships with adults, to feel like they matter to what's happening. I think a lot of that can be done in schools and communities. But I think there's a growing body of knowledge about resilience that is the next step after recognizing ACEs.
I would agree that I think the vast majority of the issues we would see would be resolved if criminal justice was treated like a public health issue and like a public education issue, rather than as a punishment, a criminalization, a stigmatization of certain subsets of the population. I think sociological perspectives on criminology would be really, really helpful for influencing that kind of policy. But there are people here who could speak to that better than I could. I think it also really depends upon a very intense willingness on the part of the larger population to really self-examine the structures of systemic oppression that do exist, that create not just incarceration, but specifically the disparities that we see in incarceration, not just along racial, but also along socioeconomic, educational background, all of those types of things as well.
So we have a couple of minutes for some more questions, and I see lots of hands up, so this is good. And I want to be sure that we can get to them. So if we could keep our responses.
Sorry.
No one's talking. It's not a judgment, but I just want to be able to get to as many hands as we can in the remaining time.
My question was directed to, I guess, everyone that works at Shakopee. For someone that hasn't visited Shakopee since she was like 23, and I am now 40, I wanted to know, you talked about one coordinator, 76% are women, women in prison are mothers. How does that program actually work? Is it a certain day? Is it a good behavior? Like, I'm an outside person looking in, I'm trying to understand, how do you make it fair to the moms for their kids to come in to visit, or is it based on behavior, which then is them having to fall in line just to get to see their kids, which probably is a whole nother issue. But I want to understand, one, if you only have one coordinator, like you said, and from my mindset, prison is a really big industry, why is there no volunteer coordinator, or why can't you hire someone else to help those women? But more importantly, what is the schedule like? Because if that's that many kids, how is that room being utilized? Like, I know that's a lot, but I'm just saying, how does that work?
I'm going to have them answer that one question so we can move on to the other one. Thank you.
So I will preface this by saying Lori Timlin, our parenting coordinator, is by far the best person to answer your question. My lame attempt will be that essentially the Anthony unit, named after Susan B. Anthony, by the way, is a structured living environment where women, they go through an application process, and they are allowed these extended visits that Rebecca has talked about. Historically, we have had a parenting program there with a parenting coordinator for a really long time, and it's been very successful. So much of it just comes down to resource allocation, and we do the best we can with what we have. And Lori's amazing, and without the doulas, that would be a huge hole. We've seen the impact that they've had as well. But really, I think the answer you're looking for is probably best provided by the person who really, and I can give you her email, and that would probably be the best way to answer your question, is to correspond with the person who oversees it, who can really give you the day in, day out what's happening.
I just wanted to ask a couple questions. And it's really nice to hear you talk about the therapeutic courts, but I had the unfortunate experience of going through a more rural county. So how can we bring, some parity between the Twin Cities, and the further away you get, the longer the sentences are, and I know that we try to rectify that with the sentencing guideline changes recently, but there's still just huge disparities in what people face when they're sentenced depending on where they live.
Part of the problem with problem-solving courts is there needs to be a kind of a threshold concentration to make the aggregation of resources worth it. But I know the goal of the Judicial Council, and there's a lot of support in the legislature, is to have a drug court available to every person in Minnesota. So at least with drug courts, that's the plan.
Living out in a rural area, one of the clients actually I worked with through MCF Shakopee had actually been denied prenatal care for like the 3 months that she was incarcerated in a local jail in the county where I live. So yeah, we totally need to work on that and bringing just even basic quality health care to inmates in jail facilities. I think fascinatingly, there's in a couple different counties, there's some really interesting restorative justice models that are being used as an alternative to incarceration sentences that may be a way to kind of help resolve some of the resource allocation issues that we're facing. But that's really, it's only being used for certain types of offenses versus others, and I think that there's still going to be some serious disparities even after that.
So I believe we have time for one more question, but again, there is a reception afterwards. I wanted to make sure that we are having a reception, but yes, we are having a reception afterwards. So there will be time to meet with the panelists and the panelists beforehand, and Amanda, to ask your question if it didn't get answered in the sessions.
Sorry. This is just more of a comment, so it'll be quick. I was trying to think of something like holistic for families, and maybe Judge Peterson, this would be a good idea. Like we have drug court and we have those other problem-solving courts. Couldn't there be like a CPS court or like a family court where they're meeting constantly and like just giving a lot of resources to these families? Or does that already exist?
Well, we did have a demonstration grant from the Office of Child Support Enforcement, the federal office, for a 3-year project we did here called Co-Parent Court for low-income unmarried parents establishing paternity, where we provided some of the same array of services for that kind of a group. And actually, the funding was discontinued by the federal government. The legislature just appropriated $200,000 more for that work. So there's some hope there. But also, I think that child protection is becoming, I have not served in juvenile court, but my impression is there's more of a public health model being employed there than has been in the past. I can't speak to the details, but I know, for example, one thing that's happened in juvenile court is the Juvenile Detention Initiative has dropped the population of the Juvenile Detention Center to a half or a third of what it used to be. So day treatment facilities and things like that are being used now in place of incarceration for juveniles.
Well,
One
Yes
more.
or no question.
okay.
The Minnesota Constitution has it on its record that all inmates are provided with adequate health care. In a yes or no answer, could you just say if the Minnesota Department of Corrections is doing that?
From my perspective, I would say yes. The women probably have some different ideas, but I think given the resources we have, yes, we have amazing nursing staff, healthcare staff. Yep.
Well, thank you to our panelists. It was a very great discussion. Thank you. So thank you for coming on this beautiful Friday afternoon. I think we had a lot of great discussion, and we would like you to continue the discussion right along here. There's refreshments, and feel free to ask people questions and network. Thank you.